The moment Kaelen called her name, Elara knew her life would never be the same. She just didn't know it would end first. Elara Vance. His voice cut through the grand clearing like a blade through silk, amplified by the alpha authority thrumming in his blood, carrying across hundreds of assembled wolves. The crowd's collective intake of breath was a living thing, sharp and hungry. He said my name. He said my name. He said my name. Elara's hands were clammy against the rough weave of her dress, the only one she owned that wasn't patched. Around her, the Omegas shifted, opening a path without looking at her. Even they knew. She'd been standing behind them, where the Runt always stood, but now the crowd was parting. The moon hung directly overhead, a perfect silver coin burning in the black sky. The air tasted of pine resin and damp earth, and the sharp metallic tang of 400 wolves preparing for the most sacred night of the year. The Great Gathering, the night when fated bonds were revealed, when the moon goddess herself reached down and touched her chosen pairs. For 4 years, Elara had felt the pull, a silver thread humming beneath her skin, connecting her to him, to Kaelen, the future alpha of the Silver Moon Pack. Their fated bond had been the pack's worst-kept secret, whispered about in corners, a source of confused speculation. How could someone like him be bound to someone like her? But the goddess didn't make mistakes. That's what Elara had told herself every day for 4 years. Every time someone called her Runt, every time she failed to shift, while pups half her age sprouted fur and fangs. Every time her sister Seraphina's golden wolf had drawn gasps of admiration while Elara remained stubbornly, humiliatingly human. The bond was her proof. The bond was her salvation. Tonight, they'll finally see. Her legs trembled as she pushed through the crowd. Wolves pressed close on either side. She could smell their territorial scents, their curiosity, their contempt. At the front of the clearing, she caught a glimpse of Seraphina among the elite warriors, all gleaming dark hair and confident laughter. Beautiful. Perfect. Everything Elara had never been. But Seraphina wasn't fated to the future alpha. Kaelen stood in the center of the ceremonial circle, bathed in moonlight. He was everything an alpha should be, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted their place in the world. His eyes swept across the crowd as Elara approached, and for one breathless moment, their gazes met. The silver thread between them yanked, pulling her forward like a fish on a line. This was it. This was everything. Elara stepped into the circle, into the center of the clearing, into the blazing attention of her entire pack. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She was so focused on Kaelen's face, on finally being seen, that she almost missed the expression in his eyes. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't joy. It wasn't the recognition of a fated mate finally claiming what was his. It was cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of anything that looked like love. But she was already moving, already committed. The entire pack's attention fixed on her as she crossed those final steps, the distance between her old life and her new one shrinking with every heartbeat. "See me," she prayed. "Please, just see me." She stopped 3 feet from Kaelen, close enough to smell the mint and pine of his scent, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough to see, with terrible clarity, that the coldness in his eyes wasn't confusion or nervousness. It was contempt. "Kaelen?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. He didn't answer. He just watched her, his expression settling into something that made her stomach twist with the first whispers of dread. The clearing had gone absolutely silent. Even the torches seemed to burn quieter, their flames barely flickering in the still mountain air. 400 wolves, holding their breath, waiting. On the raised granite platform at the edge of the clearing, the honored guests watched. Visiting alphas from allied packs, high-ranking warriors, her father, Alpha Vance, his weathered face unreadable in the torchlight, and beside him, in the shadows, something else, someone else. Elara's eyes skipped over the darkness, her attention locked on Kaelen, on the bond screaming between them, but for just a heartbeat, she felt it. A weight, a presence, ancient and vast and utterly terrifying, watching from the shadows with eyes that burned like molten gold. Then Kaelen moved, and she forgot everything else. He began to circle her, slowly, deliberately, the way a predator circles prey. "We gather tonight," he said, his voice formal and booming with ceremonial authority, under the goddess's eye. A responding howl rose from the pack, deep and resonant and primal. The sound vibrated in Elara's chest, calling to the wolf she'd never been able to reach. Kaelen continued circling, his eyes never leaving her even as he addressed the crowd. We gather to honor the bonds she gifts us. We gather to secure the future of the Silver Moon Pack. Yes, Elara thought desperately. Yes, that's why we're here. The bond, our bond. A future, Kaelen said, his voice dropping into something colder. That must be powerful, whispers rippled through the crowd. Elara turned with him, trying to keep him in her line of sight, trying to understand the shift in the air, the sudden tension crackling through the clearing like lightning about to strike. A future that must be pure, Kaelen continued. He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Close enough that the silver thread of their bond pulled taut between them, screaming at her to close the distance, to touch him, to complete what the goddess had started, but his eyes held her frozen in place. A future, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, though in the absolute silence of the clearing, every word carried, that cannot be built on a mistake of fate. The word hit Elara like a fist to the solar plexus. Mistake. What? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it, small and broken and afraid. Kaelen leaned in, close enough that his breath ghosted across her ear, his voice a cruel murmur that only she could hear even as 400 pairs of eyes watched them. Did you really think I would bind myself to weakness? The world tilted. Did you really think you could be Luna? Something inside Elara's chest cracked. The fragile hope she'd been nurturing for 4 years, the desperate belief that the bond meant something, that she meant something. It splintered like ice under a hammer. Kaelen, please. Her voice broke. The bond. You feel it. I know you feel what I feel, he said, pulling back to look at her with open disgust. Is the goddess's mockery. He turned away from her, walked back to the exact center of the circle, raised his arms to the moon hanging perfectly overhead the moment of maximum power, when the goddess's attention was fixed on her children below, when bonds were meant to be celebrated and claimed and honored. When Kaelen spoke again, his voice carried across the clearing with the force of a physical blow, every word imbued with alpha dominance and ceremonial weight that made even the strongest wolves in the crowd lower their heads in automatic submission. I, Kaelen of the Silver Moon, future alpha of this pack. No. The realization hit Elara with the force of a freight train. This wasn't a claiming. This was, do publicly reject you, Elara Vance. No, no, please, no. As my fated mate, the bond didn't break. It tore. The silver thread connecting her to Kaelen, the one she'd felt humming beneath her skin for 4 years, the proof of her worth, her salvation, her everything was ripped from her chest with savage, brutal force. Hey viewers, just a quick thanks for clicking on my video. It means the world. If you are new here and enjoy these stories, join the family by hitting the subscribe button. Chapter 1. Elara's scream tore from her throat before she could stop it. It wasn't pain. Pain was too small a word. This was agony. This was her soul being shredded, set on fire, torn into pieces and scattered. White-hot and blinding and absolute, she felt the bond shatter inside her, felt pieces of herself dissolve like ash, felt a gaping, howling wound rip open in her chest where the connection had been. Her legs gave out. She hit the ground hard, her knees slamming into packed earth. Her hands flew to her chest, clutching at the place where the bond had been, where now there was only a screaming void of emptiness and loss and pain so intense she couldn't breathe around it. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Not of sympathy, of shock, of horror at what they were witnessing. This wasn't a simple severing. This was a public execution of a sacred bond. This was a desecration. Kaelen stood above her, watching her collapse with cold satisfaction. When he spoke again, his voice was clear and strong and utterly merciless. The moon goddess was mistaken, he declared, pointing down at Elara's crumpled form. Our pack cannot be led by weakness. We cannot be represented by this. He gestured at her with open contempt, and the crowd's whispers grew louder. She is weak, Kaelen said, his voice ringing with certainty. She is unsuitable. She is nothing but a runt. The last word fell like a hammer blow. The familiar insult, the one that had followed Elara her entire life, now carried the weight of divine judgment. If the future alpha said she was weak, then she was weak. If he said the goddess was wrong, then he must be right. Elara couldn't breathe. The pain in her chest was too great, too consuming. The world had gone gray at the edges, the silver moonlight turning sickly and dim. She could hear the pack's whispers turning from shock to agreement, could feel their judgment pressing down on her like a physical weight. She looked up, desperate, through the haze of tears blurring her vision. Her father sat on the platform, his face carved from stone. He made no move to intervene, no move to protect his daughter. The pack members she'd known her entire life looked away, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. She was alone. She was nothing. And Kaelen wasn't finished. "My pack," he said, turning away from her broken form as if she no longer existed, "deserves a real Luna, a strong Luna." His eyes scanned the crowd, and something in his expression shifted, became almost triumphant. "One I have chosen. No, no." Through the white-hot agony of her shattered bond, through the humiliation and the pain, Elara felt a new kind of horror beginning to bloom. Kaelen was moving again, walking with purpose toward the front ranks of the assembled wolves, toward the elite warriors standing in their ceremonial leathers, toward the one person Elara had always trusted, always loved. He was walking toward her sister. Seraphina stepped forward from the crowd, and there was no surprise on her face, no shock, no sisterly concern for Elara, still kneeling in the dirt, her soul bleeding out onto the sacred ground. Instead, Seraphina smiled. It was a slow, triumphant expression that transformed her beautiful face into something cold and calculating. She looked at Kaelen approaching her, and her smile widened. This wasn't a surprise. This was a coronation. Kaelen reached Seraphina, and without a word, without hesitation, he grabbed her by the waist and pulled her into a deep, possessive kiss. Right there, in front of the entire pack, in front of Elara. It was a brand, a claim, a brutal declaration that said more than any words could. This is what a Luna should be. This is what strength looks like. This is what I choose. The pack's stunned silence shattered into confused murmurs. This was a betrayal beyond anything they'd expected. To reject a fated mate was already a profound insult to the goddess, but to do it publicly, cruelly, and then immediately claim another? It was unthinkable. Kaelen broke the kiss but kept Seraphina plastered against his side, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. He lifted her hand high, his voice ringing with pride and certainty. "This is your future, Luna," he roared. "Seraphina, my chosen mate." For a long moment, the pack hesitated. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, a few scattered claps began. Then, a few more. And within moments, the clearing filled with a ragged, uncertain, but growing cheer. They were choosing their alpha. They were choosing power over fate. They were choosing Seraphina over Elara. The sound of their applause was a second assault, each clap like a blow to Elara's already shattered chest. She looked up through her tears, her vision tunneling, her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps, and she saw her sister. Seraphina was looking right at her, over Kaelen's shoulder as he nuzzled her neck. As the pack celebrated around them, Seraphina's eyes found Elara's. She didn't look away. She held her sister's broken gaze deliberately, intentionally, and she smirked. It was a small expression. Vicious. Knowing. It said, "You never had a chance. He was always mine." The dual betrayal her fated mate and her sister was too much. The agony in her chest, the public humiliation, the weight of that single, triumphant smirk was more than Elara's shattered spirit could bear. The world went black at the edges, closing in like a tunnel collapsing. Her body, no longer able to support even her grief, gave out completely. Elara collapsed, unconscious, onto the cold earth of the clearing. The last sound she registered was the pack cheering for Kaelen and Seraphina, celebrating their new future. But as her consciousness faded into merciful darkness, a new sound cut through the celebration. It was not a cheer. It was a low, resonant growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound so deep it vibrated in the bones of every wolf present. A sound saturated with ancient power and cold, absolute fury. The cheering died, and in the shadows of the raised platform, golden eyes opened, burning, watching, enraged. Chapter 2. The cheering for Kaelen and Seraphina died in the throats of 400 wolves. It didn't fade. It didn't taper off. It stopped, as if someone had physically strangled the sound from the air itself. The temperature in the clearing dropped, not gradually, Not gently. It plummeted, cold rushing in like an avalanche of ice water, stealing the breath from every lung, turning the sweat on skin to frost. That growl came again. Deeper this time. Resonant. Ancient. A sound that didn't belong to any wolf in the Silver Moon Pack. A sound that belonged to something older. Something that made even the strongest alphas in the crowd suddenly remember what it felt like to be prey. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that several wolves clapped their hands over their ears. The torches flickered wildly, their flames turning from warm orange to an eerie blue-white. The silver moonlight seemed to dim, as if a great shadow had passed over the face of the goddess herself. And then the power hit. It rolled across the clearing like a physical wave, pure, primal, absolutely overwhelming dominance. Not the authority of an alpha commanding his pack, not even the ceremonial weight of an alpha king addressing multiple territories. This was the dominance of something that stood above all wolves, something that made alphas look like pups, something ancient. The omegas went down first, forced to their knees by the sheer weight of that power. Then the betas, their heads bowing involuntarily, their wolves whimpering in submission inside their skulls. The warriors tried to resist, tried to stand tall, but even they found themselves lowering their heads, their shoulders curving forward in automatic deference. Kaelen, who had been standing proud and triumphant with Seraphina plastered against his side, felt his knees begin to buckle. He locked them, fighting against the instinct to submit. His alpha blood screaming at him to hold his ground, to protect his position, to not bow. But his head tilted down anyway. Just slightly. Just enough. Even Alpha Vance, seated on the raised platform, was forced to stand and bend his knee. A profound, humiliating act of submission on his own territory, in front of his own pack. This wasn't pack authority. This was the authority of the world. Every eye, wide with sudden terror, turned toward the granite platform where the honored guests sat, where the shadows had been sitting. A figure stepped forward from the darkness. He moved with absolute silence, no footfall on stone, no rustle of fabric, just smooth, predatory motion that was more animal than human despite his form. He was tall, dressed in dark leathers that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it, and power radiated from him in visible waves that distorted the air like heat shimmer. But it was his eyes that held the pack frozen. They weren't the warm amber of a normal alpha wolf. They weren't the yellow gold of a particularly powerful bloodline. They were molten, burning with an unnatural golden fire that looked like the heart of a forge, like the sun trapped behind a mortal face. Ancient, terrible, beautiful. King Alaric of the Lycan Kingdom had been a myth to most of the Silver Moon Pack, a story told to disobedient pups to make them behave. The alpha of alphas, the Blood King, the last living member of the original Lycan bloodline that predated even the oldest pack territories. He ruled the Lycan Kingdom from a fortress carved into the heart of the northern mountains, and for him to attend a simple pack gathering like this was unprecedented. An honor, a formality to acknowledge Alpha Vance's petition for expanded territory. He had been sitting in the shadows, silent and observing, for the entire ceremony, and now he was furious. The pack could smell it on him, not the hot, quick anger of a territorial dispute, but cold, patient, absolute wrath. It smelled like ozone before a lightning strike, like blood on snow, like the moment before an avalanche buried a village whole. King Alaric's burning golden eyes swept across the assembled wolves with open contempt. They skipped over Kaelen, over Seraphina, still frozen against him, over Alpha Vance trembling on his platform. His gaze locked on the small, broken form lying unconscious in the center of the clearing. On Elara, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then the Blood King moved. He descended from the platform with smooth, deliberate steps. Each footfall was silent, but the weight of his presence made the ground feel like it trembled anyway. The crowd parted before him without conscious thought, wolves scrambling backward to clear a path, their heads lowered, their wolves howling in submission inside their minds. He walked across the sacred ceremonial ground, the space where bonds were meant to be honored, where the goddess's gifts were meant to be celebrated, and the fury radiating from him made the torches gutter and nearly go out. Kaelen, his bravado finally crumbling under the weight of that terrible presence, found his voice. It came out strangled, higher than he intended. "Your Majesty," he stammered, his alpha authority completely stripped away by the power pressing down on him. This is a simple pack matter. She was unsuitable. She's just a runt." The Blood King's head turned, slowly, deliberately. He looked at Kaelen, and he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes alone carried the weight of a death sentence. The air temperature dropped another 20 degrees. Frost began to form on the packed earth, on the torches, on the breath that misted from 400 pairs of terrified lungs. Kaelen made a sound something between a gasp and a choke as the air itself seemed to freeze in his throat. The king's aura flared, a suffocating blanket of pure dominance that wrapped around Kaelen's chest like iron bands and squeezed. Kaelen's knees buckled. He went down hard, slamming into the ground with a cry of pain, his hands flying to his throat even though there was nothing physical choking him. Seraphina stumbled away from him, her eyes wide with terror, her face as white as the moon overhead. King Alaric held Kaelen there on his knees, gasping, helpless for 3 long seconds. A demonstration, a warning, a promise of what would happen if Kaelen spoke again. Then the pressure released, and Kaelen collapsed forward onto his hands, coughing and retching, his entire body shaking. The Blood King turned away from him as if he were an insect beneath notice. His attention returned to Elara. He crossed the remaining distance in 4 long strides, and then in a move that sent a shockwave of disbelief through every witness present, he knelt. King Alaric, the Blood King, the Alpha of Alphas, the ruler of the Lycan Kingdom who made other Alphas tremble at the mention of his name, knelt in the dirt. Before a rejected Omega, 400 wolves stared in absolute silence. This was impossible. This was unthinkable. Kings didn't kneel. Not for anyone. Not ever. But there he was. One knee pressed into the cold earth, his dark leathers pooling around him like shadows made solid. He reached out with one hand bare, not gloved, and his fingers were long and elegant, and had probably ended more lives than anyone in this clearing could count. Those fingers, stained with the blood of traitors and enemies and anyone foolish enough to challenge his rule, now moved with shocking gentleness. He brushed a strand of matted hair from Elara's face. She was cold. Her skin had gone gray, her lips bloodless. The spiritual wound of the broken bond had nearly killed her, would have killed a weaker wolf. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular gasps that looked painful. King Alaric's jaw tightened. The muscle there jumped. His eyes, fixed on her unconscious face, burned with something that went beyond fury. This wasn't just an insult to the goddess. This wasn't just the cruel rejection of a fated bond. This was personal. He slid his hand under her chin, tilting her face up toward his. His touch was firm, commanding, impossible to resist even unconscious. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant only for her, but in the absolute silence of the clearing, every wolf heard it anyway. They did this to you. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an accusation, a promise of retribution. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, and something in his expression shifted, softened, just for a heartbeat, before hardening into something even more terrifying. Look at me. It was a command, not a request, not a plea. A command, imbued with the full weight of his ancient bloodline, with power that bypassed consciousness and struck directly at the soul itself. It was the voice of a king who had ruled for centuries, who had bent entire territories to his will, who had never, in 1,000 years, been refused. Elara's eyelids fluttered. Her body, broken and barely clinging to consciousness, had no choice but to obey. Her eyes opened. They were dull, glassy, swimming with unshed tears and the lingering agony of her shattered bond. Empty. She was barely there, a shell, her spirit already half fled from the unbearable pain. Her unfocused gaze drifted upward, struggling to find the source of that command. And then her eyes met his. Golden fire meeting broken blue. The world exploded. The bond that detonated between them wasn't gentle. It wasn't a soft silver thread humming beneath the skin. It wasn't a quiet recognition or a gentle pull. It was a cataclysm, a supernova of destiny that slammed into both of them with the force of a meteor strike. For Elara, it felt like being struck by lightning. The golden fire of the king's bond crashed into her chest, not where Kaelen's bond had been torn away, but deeper, in a place she hadn't known existed. It surged through her like molten gold, like liquid sunlight, filling the screaming void left by the rejection with something infinitely more powerful. The agony of her shattered bond was incinerated, vaporized, consumed by this new connection like a candle flame swallowed by a forest fire. The golden power flooded her, mending the tear in her spirit, sealing the wound in her soul. It was overwhelming, terrifying, all-consuming. It filled every empty space inside her until she felt like she might burst apart from the sheer pressure of it. But beneath the terror, beneath the overwhelming sensation, was something else. Warmth. Absolute. Possessive. Unshakable. Safe. For King Alaric, the bond was a shock that rocked him to his very foundation. He had lived for over 1,000 years. He had assumed, centuries ago, that his fated mate had been lost to time, dead before he could find her. Her soul returned to the goddess. He had accepted his solitude, had hardened his heart against the possibility of ever finding what other wolves took for granted. And now, she was here, this broken girl, this rejected Omega, this child kneeling in the mud with her spirit bleeding out, cast aside by a pathetic excuse for an alpha who didn't deserve to breathe the same air. The scent he detected from the shadows, pine and stone and dormant magic, it was hers, his mate. The rage that had been cold and calculated turned into something primal, something volcanic. This wasn't just an insult to the goddess anymore. This wasn't just witnessing the desecration of a sacred bond. This was a direct, personal, unforgivable assault on his queen. Elara's eyes, which had been empty and dull with shock and pain, suddenly focused. The golden fire of their bond blazed in her pupils, rimming her irises with molten light. She was no longer looking at a terrifying stranger, no longer looking at a king. She was looking at the other half of her own soul. King Alaric's expression, which had been a mask of cold fury, shifted into something far more dangerous. He rose to his feet in one smooth motion, pulling Elara up with him. His hand slid from her chin to the back of her neck, holding her steady as her legs threatened to give out again. The golden aura of their bond was visible now, shimmering in the air around them like heat waves, like the aurora borealis made solid. It pushed back against the cold, warming the frost-covered ground, making the guttering torches flare back to life. 400 wolves stared in absolute shock. A true bond, a king's bond, with the rejected Runt. Kaelen, still on his hands and knees in the dirt, looked up. His face had gone the color of old ash. He could smell it now, the overwhelming, possessive, ancient scent of the king's bond with Elara. It was 1,000 times stronger than the silver thread that had connected them. It filled the clearing, drowning out every other scent, marking Elara as claimed in a way that left no room for doubt or argument. "What?" Kaelen's voice came out as a broken rasp. "What did you— She was mine, she was—" King Alaric's head snapped toward him. The look in his eyes was no longer cold, it was murderous. "She was yours to cherish," the Blood King said, his voice a low, deadly vibration that made every wolf in the clearing flinch. "Yours to protect, yours to honor." He took one slow, deliberate step toward Kaelen and Seraphina. They both scrambled backward, tripping over each other in their haste to get away from that terrible presence. "You," King Alaric hissed, his voice dropping even lower, "have rejected your destiny. You have defiled a sacred bond. You have cast aside the one chosen for you by the moon goddess herself." He paused, and a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a predator about to tear into prey. His golden eyes slid to Seraphina, who made a small, terrified sound and tried to hide behind Kaelen's larger frame. "You cast her aside," the king said, his voice dripping with contempt. "For this. For ambition. For a worthless, hollow-hearted—" He cut himself off, his fury too great for simple insults. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and the air pressure dropped again, making ears pop and vision blur. Then he turned his back on them, the ultimate dismissal, and returned to Elara. She was standing on her own now, though barely. Her legs trembled, her hands clutched at the fabric of her dress, and her eyes were still wide with shock. But she was standing. The golden bond between them thrummed with power, visible to every eye, undeniable proof of what had just happened. King Alaric didn't offer his hand gently. He gripped her arm firm, possessive, claiming and pulled her against his side. His arm wrapped around her waist like a band of steel, tucking her small frame against him in a gesture that left no room for interpretation. "Mine." Elara stumbled slightly, and he held her up effortlessly, his presence a wall of solid strength at her back. Then he turned to face the assembled pack, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the clearing with the force of a physical blow. "Witness." The word was a command that made even the strongest wolves in the crowd lower their heads in automatic submission. "Witness what happens," King Alaric continued, his golden eyes sweeping across the crowd with cold satisfaction. "To a gift of the goddess, when it is given to one who is worthy." And there, In the center of the clearing where Elara had been rejected and humiliated and broken, King Alaric of the Lycan Kingdom tilted her head back with one hand. Elara's breath hitched. Her sapphire eyes, now ringed with gold from their bond, went wide. "You are mine," he growled, his voice dropping into something primal and possessive that made her shiver. Then he lowered his head, and his fangs longer and sharper than any normal wolf's extended. And he claimed her. His teeth sank deep into the soft skin of her neck, right over the spot where a fated mark should sit, where Kaelen's mark should have been but never was. The claiming bite was fierce, possessive, permanent, a brand that would mark her as his for the rest of her life and beyond. The golden bond between them detonated. Not a gentle awakening, a detonation. Elara's scream tore across the clearing, not of pain, but of pure, overwhelming power. Her back arched, her hands flying to King Alaric's shoulders to steady herself as the ancient strength of the Lycan bloodline poured into her like a tidal wave. It wasn't just a claiming bite. It was an awakening. The dormant power in Elara's own bloodline, the goddess-touched magic that had been suppressed by the wolfsbane ash her parents had been poisoning her with since childhood, suddenly blazed to life. A visible shockwave of golden energy erupted from her body, blasting outward in a perfect circle. Wolves threw their arms up to shield their faces. The torches went out completely. Even the moonlight seemed to bend around the raw power radiating from the center of the clearing. When the light faded, Elara was transformed. King Alaric lifted his head from her neck, his lips stained with her blood. He licked the wound clean with careful deliberation, sealing it with the ancient magic of his bloodline. The bite mark healed instantly, leaving behind an intricate golden design that glowed with inner fire, the mark of a queen. Elara's eyes, which had been dull blue, the eyes of a powerless Omega, were now a bright, sharp, burning sapphire, ringed with molten gold. The eyes of someone touched by ancient magic. The eyes of someone who was no longer weak. She stood straight now, her trembling gone. The golden aura of the king's bond wrapped around her like armor, and beneath it, her own power, finally free after 20 years of suppression, hummed in her veins like electricity. She was no longer Elara the rejected. She was Elara the claimed, and every wolf in the clearing could feel the difference. Chapter 3. The clearing was silent. Not the heavy, terrified silence from moments ago when King Alaric's power had forced 400 wolves to their knees. This was different. Stunned. Disbelieving. The kind of silence that follows a lightning strike, when the world itself seems to pause and recalibrate. Elara stood in the center of it all, wrapped in the Blood King's possessive embrace, and felt alive for the first time in her entire life. The pain of Kaelen's rejection was gone. Not dulled. Not buried. Gone. Incinerated by the golden fire of the true bond now burning in her chest. Where there had been a screaming void, there was now warmth, power, connection. She could feel King Alaric through the bond, his presence a constant, steady weight at the back of her mind. Ancient, powerful, utterly certain. His arm around her waist was an iron band, holding her against his side in a way that made it clear to everyone watching. She belongs to me. And for the first time in 20 years, Elara didn't feel like the runt. She felt like she could breathe. But the euphoria of the bond couldn't completely drown out the awareness of where she was. What had just happened? The 400 pairs of eyes staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to horror to something that looked almost like fear of her. The golden mark on her neck pulsed with warmth, visible even in the dim torchlight. She could feel it there, not painful, but present. A brand. A claim. Proof that she belonged to someone infinitely more powerful than the Alpha who had cast her aside. Kaelen. Elara's eyes found him almost against her will. He was still on the ground where King Alaric's power had forced him, kneeling in the dirt with his hands braced against the earth. But he wasn't looking at the king anymore. He was staring at her. At the golden mark on her neck. At the way the Blood King held her. At the visible aura of power shimmering around them both. And his face. His face was a mask of absolute devastation. The void. That's what he'd called it, wasn't it? The emptiness left behind when a fated bond was rejected. Elara had felt it, briefly, in that terrible moment between Kaelen's rejection and King Alaric's claiming. That howling, aching wrongness where something essential should have been. She could see it in Kaelen now. In the hollow look in his eyes. In the way his hands trembled against the ground. In the sudden, visible realization of what he'd done, what he'd lost. For a heartbeat, just one, Elara almost felt sorry for him. Then she remembered the coldness in his eyes when he'd circled her, the contempt in his voice when he'd called her weak, the calculated cruelty of his rejection, designed for maximum humiliation in front of the entire pack. The pity died. King Alaric must have felt something through their bond, a flicker of her attention shifting to Kaelen because his arm tightened around her waist, not painfully, possessively. A reminder, you're mine now. He doesn't matter. The king's golden eyes swept across the crowd with cold satisfaction, taking in the prostrate wolves, the extinguished torches, the lingering scent of terror in the air. When he spoke, his voice carried across the clearing with absolute authority. The Silver Moon Pack, he said, each word precise and cutting, is in disgrace. The wolves flinched as if struck. Even Alpha Vance, still standing on the platform with his knee bent in submission, went rigid. You have insulted the moon goddess, King Alaric continued, his tone flat and emotionless, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been shouting. You have permitted the desecration of a sacred bond. You have stood by and celebrated while your future alpha spat in the face of destiny itself. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fearful. Desperate. You have wronged, the Blood King said, his voice dropping into something darker. Your queen. The word hit the clearing like a thunderclap. Queen. Not mate. Not consort. Queen. A fresh wave of shock rolled through the assembled wolves. Elara felt it too, her eyes going wide, her breath catching. Queen. He was calling her. Your Majesty. Alpha Vance's voice cracked as he spoke, his weathered face pressed toward the ground, in the deepest bow Elara had ever seen him make. Queen Elara, please. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. It was, his voice broke. It was my son's choice. His alone. King Alaric's eyes slid to the Alpha with cold amusement. It was, he agreed, his voice a deadly purr. And your son will have a lifetime to regret it. He turned his attention back to the crowd, and his expression hardened into something that made even the strongest warriors take an instinctive step backward. But the pack that allowed this, that stood silent while their future alpha committed sacrilege, will also face consequences. The fear in the clearing intensified. Wolves began whispering frantically to each other, their scents spiking with panic. What did that mean? What kind of consequences? Would he destroy them? Strip Alpha Vance of his territory? Dissolve the pack entirely? King Alaric let them stew in their terror for a long moment, then a sound shattered the tense silence. Laughter. Hysterical, broken, edged with madness. Every head turned toward the source. Seraphina stood near the edge of the ceremonial circle, her crimson dress torn at the hem where she'd stumbled away from Kaelen. Her dark hair, which had been perfectly styled at the start of the ceremony, now fell in wild tangles around her face. Her eyes were too wide, too bright, dancing with something that looked like the edge of a complete breakdown. She was staring at Elara, and she was laughing. No, Seraphina said, the word coming out breathless and sharp between fits of laughter. No. This is a trick. She took a stumbling step forward, pointing at Elara with a shaking hand. I'm the Luna, her voice cracked, climbing toward a shriek. Kaelen chose me. She whirled toward Kaelen, still kneeling in the dirt. Tell them you chose me. Kaelen didn't respond. He was still staring at Elara with that hollow, devastated expression, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Seraphina's face twisted with fury. She turned back to the crowd, to King Alaric, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She's an Omega, Seraphina screamed. She's nothing. She can't even shift. This, she gestured wildly at the golden mark on Elara's neck, at the visible bond between her and the king. This is some kind of enchantment. She's bewitched him, just like she... Be silent. Elara's voice cut through Seraphina's hysterics like a blade. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout, but it carried power, the golden authority of the king's bond, the awakened magic in her own bloodline, all wrapped into two simple words. Seraphina's mouth snapped shut, not by choice. Her jaw clamped together as if an invisible hand had seized it, her eyes going wide with shock and rage. She tried to speak again, tried to force words past her lips, but nothing came out except a strangled, muffled sound. The entire pack stared. Elara the Runt, the wolfless shame of the Alpha's family, had just commanded the golden child into silence, and Seraphina had obeyed. King Alaric looked down at Elara, and for the first time since he'd emerged from the shadows, something that might have been approval flickered in his burning golden eyes. His hand moved from her waist to the back of her neck, his thumb brushing over the claiming mark in a gesture that was equal parts possessive and approving. "Well done," he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. But Elara barely registered the praise. Her eyes were locked on her sister. Seraphina's face had gone from furious to terrified in the span of a heartbeat. She was shaking now, her hands pressed against her throat as if she could physically pry the silence command away. Tears of rage and fear streaked down her perfect face, smearing the careful cosmetics she'd applied for what was supposed to be her coronation as Luna. Looking at her sister now, disheveled, hysterical, powerless, Elara felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. This wasn't random. This wasn't just Seraphina being in the right place when Kaelen decided to reject his fated mate. Seraphina had known. The realization hit Elara with the force of a physical blow. She took a half step forward, only King Alaric's hand on her neck keeping her anchored in place. "You knew," Elara said, her voice quiet but carrying across the silent clearing. "You knew he was going to reject me." Seraphina's eyes widened further. She shook her head frantically, still unable to speak, but the guilt was written across every line of her face. "How long?" Elara's voice was getting louder now, the hurt and betrayal she'd been too shocked to feel earlier finally crashing over her. "How long have you been planning this?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't pack business anymore. This was family business, playing out in front of everyone, and it was the kind of ugly, intimate betrayal that made even strangers want to look away. But no one did. Everyone watched, transfixed, as Elara took another step toward her sister. "Let her speak," Elara said, and the command in her voice was stronger now, more certain. The invisible hold on Seraphina's jaw released. She gasped, her hands flying to her throat, gulping air even though she hadn't actually been choking. For a moment, Elara thought she might try to run, might try to deny everything, but then Seraphina's expression shifted. The fear drained away, replaced by something cold, calculating. The mask she'd been wearing of the hysterical, confused sister, caught up in circumstances beyond her control, cracked and fell away completely. What remained underneath was ugly. "You want to know how long?" Seraphina's voice was hoarse, but steady now, almost conversational. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked Elara dead in the eye. "Since the bond first appeared." 4 years ago. The admission sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the crowd. "I saw the way he looked at you that day," Seraphina continued, her lips curling into a sneer. "During the hunt. That recognition. I knew what it meant. I knew the goddess had made a mistake and given him to you instead of me." "The goddess doesn't make mistakes," someone in the crowd muttered, but Seraphina ignored them. "So I fixed it," she said simply. "I went to Kaelen that night, told him the truth that you were weak, that Aluna needs to be strong, powerful, capable of leading, that the pack would never respect him if he claimed someone who couldn't even shift." Elara felt sick. "You poisoned him against me!" "I showed him reality," Seraphina snapped. "You think he wanted to be tied to the Runt for the rest of his life? You think he wanted his children to carry your defective bloodline? I gave him permission to do what he already wanted to do." She gestured at Kaelen, still kneeling silently in the dirt, and her expression twisted with contempt. "It wasn't even hard. A few conversations, a few carefully placed doubts. He was eager to believe you weren't good enough, because deep down, he already thought it was true." The words were daggers, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Elara's hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. The golden bond with King Alaric flared in her chest, responding to her emotional turmoil with a surge of protective fury that wasn't entirely her own. "And tonight?" Elara forced the question past the tightness in her throat. "The kiss? You and him?" Seraphina's sneer transformed into something triumphant. "That was the best part," she said, her voice dripping with vicious satisfaction. "Watching you break, watching you collapse, watching the entire pack celebrate while you bled out on the ground." She took a step forward, and now it was her turn to close the distance between them. Her voice dropped lower, intimate and cruel, meant only for Elara even though everyone could hear. "I looked you in the eye, little sister. I let you see exactly how much I enjoyed it. And you know what the best part was?" Seraphina leaned in close, her breath hot against Elara's ear. You never had a chance. He was always mine. The silence that followed was absolute. Seraphina pulled back, and there finally was the expression Elara remembered from earlier. That small, vicious, knowing smirk. The one that had been the last thing she'd seen before consciousness had fled. Except this time, Elara wasn't collapsing. This time, she was standing in the center of the clearing with the Blood King's claiming mark burning gold on her neck and ancient power humming in her veins. This time, she wasn't broken. And Seraphina, beautiful, perfect, golden child, Seraphina had just confessed her betrayal in front of 400 witnesses, including a king who did not tolerate treachery. King Alaric's voice, when he spoke, was soft, deadly, fascinating. Seraphina's triumphant expression faltered. She seemed to suddenly remember where she was, who she was standing in front of. The color drained from her face. Your Majesty, You orchestrated the desecration of a fated bond, King Alaric said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. You manipulated a future alpha into committing sacrilege. You enjoyed watching your sister suffer. He tilted his head, studying Seraphina the way a scientist might study an insect pinned to a board. Tell me, he said. Did you really think there would be no consequences? Seraphina opened her mouth. Closed it. Her eyes darted around the clearing, looking for support, for someone to speak on her behalf. No one met her gaze. Even Kaelen, her supposed chosen mate, was staring at her with something between horror and disgust, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. Seraphina's voice came out as a whisper. It was for the good of the pack. She's weak. Silence, King Alaric said, and this time his command carried the full weight of his ancient authority. Seraphina's jaw snapped shut again, but this time her whole body locked up with it. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, her eyes wide with terror. The Blood King looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away from her completely, the ultimate dismissal, and addressed Elara Vance. Your daughter, he said, has confessed to manipulating pack politics and orchestrating the desecration of a sacred bond. By Lycan law, that is treason against the goddess herself. Elara Vance's face went gray. Your Majesty, please. However, King Alaric continued, raising one hand to forestall any pleading, the judgment of her crimes will not be mine to pass. His golden eyes found Elara, and there was something dark and satisfied in his expression. It will be hers. Every eye in the clearing turned to Elara. She stood very still, feeling the weight of their attention, the weight of the decision being placed on her shoulders. Her sister, who had poisoned Kaelen against her, who had orchestrated her public humiliation, who had smiled while watching her break, stood frozen by the king's power, waiting for judgment. Justice would be easy, expected, deserved. But Elara looked at Seraphina, really looked at her, and saw something she hadn't expected to see. Fear. Real, genuine, trembling fear. The kind of fear that came from suddenly realizing you'd miscalculated badly, that you'd played a game you thought you understood, only to discover the rules had changed and you were on the losing side. Seraphina, for the first time in her life, was powerless, just like Elara had always been. The symmetry was almost poetic. Elara took a slow breath, feeling the golden bond with King Alaric steady and strong in her chest. She could feel his presence through it, his certainty, his power, his absolute confidence in whatever choice she made. He wouldn't judge her for showing mercy, but he wouldn't judge her for showing none, either. The choice was hers. Elara looked at her sister's terrified face, at Kaelen, still kneeling in the dirt with his hollow eyes and his devastating void, at the pack, watching with bated breath, and she made her decision. Release her, Elara said quietly. King Alaric raised one eyebrow but didn't question. The invisible hold on Seraphina released, and she collapsed forward onto her hands and knees, gasping. Elara waited until her sister looked up. I'm not going to punish you, Elara said, her voice carrying across the silent clearing. Seraphina's eyes widened with desperate hope. Because you've already lost everything that matters. Elara gestured at Kaelen, still frozen in his own private hell. You wanted him? You have him. Congratulations. You're the Luna of a disgraced pack, bound to a male whose soul is slowly being consumed by the void he created. You'll watch him spiral into that emptiness for the rest of your life. You'll watch him regret rejecting me every single day. She took a step forward, and Seraphina flinched, And you'll know, Elara said softly, that while you're trapped here with your hollow victory, I'm going to be queen. The word hung in the air between them. Queen. Not just a title. A truth. Elara turned her back on her sister, on her entire former life, and walked back to King Alaric's side. He was watching her with something that might have been pride in his burning golden eyes. When she reached him, his arm wrapped around her waist again, pulling her close. Well chosen, he murmured. Then he raised his voice, addressing the pack one final time. The Silver Moon Pack will remain in disgrace until I decide otherwise. Your petition for expanded territory is denied. Your future alpha will lead you, but he will do so with the shame of his actions known across all territories. He looked at Kaelen, who had finally raised his head. Live with what you've done, King Alaric said coldly, and know that you had the goddess's gift in your hands, and you destroyed it. Then, without another word, he turned and began walking toward the edge of the clearing. Elara walked with him, her steps steady, her head high. Behind them, she could hear Seraphina starting to sob broken, desperate sounds that echoed across the silent clearing. She could hear her father trying to restore order, his voice shaking. She could hear the pack beginning to whisper, their voices a confused buzz of shock and speculation. But Elara didn't look back. She kept her eyes forward as they reached the edge of the clearing where the trees pressed close. Dark-clad figures materialized from the shadows, Lycan warriors with golden eyes identical to the king's, their faces impassive as they fell into formation around their ruler and his new mate. King Alaric paused at the threshold between the clearing and the forest. He looked down at Elara, his expression unreadable. Are you ready? He asked. Elara thought about what she was leaving behind. The pack that had scorned her, the sister who had betrayed her, the mate who had rejected her, the life where she'd been nothing but the runt. She thought about what lay ahead. A kingdom she'd only heard of in stories. A king she barely knew. A bond that burned like fire in her chest. A future she couldn't begin to imagine. Yes, she said, and she meant it. King Alaric's hand found hers, their fingers lacing together, and the golden bond between them flared to life, warming her from the inside out. Together, they stepped into the shadows. And when Elara looked back one final time, all she saw was Seraphina on her knees in the dirt, screaming her name. But Elara was already gone. Chapter 4. The Blood King's Fury. The journey through the shadows was disorienting. One moment, Elara was stepping into the darkness at the edge of the clearing, King Alaric's hand wrapped firmly around hers. The next, the world folded. It wasn't like walking through a forest. It was like being pulled through reality itself, a sensation of movement without motion, of traveling vast distances in the space between heartbeats. The air turned cold and thin, tasting of ozone and ancient magic. Elara's stomach lurched, and she gripped the king's hand tighter, her only anchor in the disorienting darkness. Then, abruptly, they were there. Elara stumbled as solid ground materialized beneath her feet. The temperature plummeted, not the crisp mountain cold of the Silver Moon territory, but a deeper chill that seemed to seep up from the stone itself. She was standing on polished black marble. The Lycan King's fortress rose around her like a cathedral carved from the bones of the mountain itself. The ceiling soared hundreds of feet overhead, lost in shadow despite the cold blue flames burning in massive braziers along the walls. Pillars of black stone, each one wide enough that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around it, supported the impossible weight above. The air smelled of dust and ozone and power, the overwhelming territorial scent of hundreds of Lycans, all of them strong enough to make even the most dominant alpha seem like a pup. "His Majesty has returned," a voice called out, formal and resonant. The vast hall was filled with them, Lycans in dark velvets and leathers, their faces beautiful and terrible and utterly inhuman in their perfection. Every single one of them had eyes like King Alaric's burning gold, ancient, weighing and measuring everything they looked at, and every single one of them was staring at her. The crowd parted as King Alaric strode forward, his hand still locked around Elara's wrist. His boots rang against the marble with sharp, authoritative clicks. He moved like he owned the world because in this place, he did. Elara had no choice but to follow, towed in his wake like a ship caught in a storm's current. The Lycans bowed as their king passed. Deep, respectful bows that spoke of genuine reverence, not the terrified submission she'd seen from her own pack. But as they rose, their golden eyes tracked to her, to the claiming mark burning on her neck, to her simple, dirt-stained dress, to the scent of wolf, not Lycan, clinging to her skin. she heard the whispers start. Sibilant. Sharp. A wolf. She's marked, but she's an omega. The words cut through Elara's fragile confidence like knives. The euphoria of the bond, of finally feeling powerful, began to crack under the weight of their contempt. These weren't pack wolves who'd known her since childhood and dismissed her out of familiarity. These were Lycan's beings so far above her on the hierarchy that she couldn't even properly comprehend the distance. To them, she wasn't just weak, she was nothing. King Alaric's hand tightened on her wrist, not painfully, but firmly. A reminder. You're mine. Their opinions don't matter. He led her through the parting crowd toward a massive throne at the far end of the hall. It was carved from a single piece of obsidian, its surface so polished it looked wet. The back rose in sharp, angular lines that suggested both a crown and the teeth of some massive predator. King Alaric stopped before the throne but didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face the assembled Lycans, pulling Elara in front of him. His hand settled on her shoulders, a clear, possessive gesture that placed her directly under his protection. A silver-haired male stepped forward from the crowd. He was tall and elegant, his face a web of aristocratic lines that suggested both great age and great power. His golden eyes fixed on Elara with something between curiosity and disapproval. "Your Majesty," the male said, his voice cultured and careful. "You were gone but a day. We did not expect complications." His gaze flickered to Elara, and the unspoken question hung in the air. "What is this?" King Alaric's hands tightened on Elara's shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was flat, absolute, allowing no room for argument. "This is Elara. My mate. Your queen." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the whispers exploded. Dozens of voices speaking at once in a chaos of disbelief and shock. The silver-haired male's eyes widened, his gaze dropping to the golden mark on Elara's neck, and then rising to her face with new, horrified understanding. "Your queen," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. "From? Where does she hail, Your Majesty?" The careful phrasing couldn't disguise what he really wanted to ask. Why does she smell like a pack wolf? Why does she look like a servant? Why is she so obviously beneath you? "From her destiny," King Alaric said coldly, his voice dropping to a dangerous chill. "Which, I might add, is now my destiny. And yours. You will all show her the respect she is owed." He began to turn, clearly intending to dismiss them, but a young Lycan near the back, his face flushed with wine and indignation, pushed forward. "But Majesty," the young male protested, his voice loud and arrogant. "She is a wolf, a pack omega, from the scent of it. She is unworthy." King Alaric moved so fast he blurred. One moment he was standing beside Elara. The next, he was across the hall, his hand wrapped around the young Lycan's throat, lifting him clear off the marble floor. The sound of choking filled the sudden, absolute silence. Elara's hand flew to her mouth. The silver-haired male took a half-step forward, his expression alarmed. "My king." King Alaric raised his free hand, silencing him without looking away from the struggling Lycan in his grip. "You," the Blood King said, his voice soft and deadly, "have precisely 5 seconds to apologize to your queen." The young male clawed at Alaric's wrist, his face turning red, then purple. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. 5. "I can't breathe." 4. "Please, Majesty." 3. Elara stepped forward, her heart hammering. This was wrong. This was too much. Yes, the male had been rude, but he didn't deserve to die for it. "Alaric," she said. "Please." The king's head snapped toward her. He stared at her, his golden eyes burning with barely contained rage. The young Lycan still dangled from his grip, seconds from unconsciousness. For a moment, Elara thought he would refuse, thought he would finish what he'd started regardless of her plea. Then, with a snarl of frustration, King Alaric threw the young male across the hall. He crashed into a stone pillar with a sickening crack and slumped to the floor, unconscious but breathing. King Alaric strode back to Elara in 3 long steps, his fury still radiating from him in hot waves. He grabbed her hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart. "No one," he growled, his eyes boring into hers with terrifying intensity, "will ever disrespect you again. That is my vow. My protection is absolute. Do you understand?" Elara nodded, breathless. He held her gaze for another moment. then turned back to the assembled Lycans. Every one of them had gone still, their expressions carefully blank. "The next person who questions my queen's worth," King Alaric said, his voice carrying across the hall like a death sentence, "will not receive mercy. Are we clear?" Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Are we clear?" "Yes, Your Majesty." The response came as one voice, sharp and immediate. King Alaric nodded once. Then he looked at the silver-haired male. "Valerius, prepare the queen's chambers. She will require appropriate clothing and attendance." "Of course, Your Majesty." Valerius bowed deeply, though his eyes flickered to Elara with something that might have been sympathy or pity. King Alaric's hand found the small of Elara's back, guiding her toward a corridor that opened off the main hall. As they walked, she could feel every golden eye following them, could hear the whispers starting again the moment they were out of immediate earshot. She'd escaped one form of contempt only to walk directly into another, but this time, she had something she'd never had before, someone who would burn the world down to protect her. Chapter 5. The Queen's chambers were vast and cold and utterly foreign. Elara stood in the center of the main room, wrapped in silence, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. The stone walls were hung with dark tapestries depicting battles and ceremonies she didn't understand. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, but even with flames roaring in it, the chill never quite left the air. She'd been bathed by silent attendants who wouldn't meet her eyes, dressed in a gown of midnight blue velvet that felt heavy as armor, fed food she couldn't taste. And through it all, the golden bond in her chest had thrummed with King Alaric's presence, distant but steady, like a star burning on the horizon. He'd left her here after showing her to the chambers, said he had matters to attend to, promised he would return. That had been hours ago. Now night had fallen properly, the narrow windows showing only darkness and stars, and Elara was alone with her thoughts. And her thoughts were chaos. She kept replaying the ceremony. Kaelen's rejection, the tearing of the bond, Seraphina's smirk, the king's golden eyes, the claiming bite, the power that had flooded through her when his fangs sank into her neck. That power still hummed in her veins now, but quieter. Waiting, Elara walked to one of the narrow windows and looked out at the darkness. Somewhere out there was the Silver Moon territory, her father, her sister, Kaelen, and his devastating void, her old life. She pressed her palm against the cold stone and felt nothing. No grief, no longing, no desire to return, just a strange, hollow sense of closure. I'm free. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it felt terrifying, because she had no idea what came next, who she was supposed to be, how to be a queen to beings who looked at her with contempt. "You should be sleeping." Elara spun, her heart leaping into her throat. King Alaric stood in the doorway. She hadn't heard him enter, hadn't heard the door open at all. He'd simply appeared, like a shadow given form. He'd removed the heavy leather coat he'd been wearing earlier. Now he wore only dark trousers and a simple black shirt, unlaced at the throat. It was the most casual she'd seen him, and somehow it made him more intimidating, not less. Without the formal trappings of kingship, he looked younger, more predatory, more real. "I couldn't," Elara admitted. "Too many thoughts." Alaric nodded as if he'd expected this. He crossed the room to stand beside her at the window, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the pine and ozone scent of him. They stood in silence for a long moment, looking out at the darkness together. "You showed mercy today," Alaric said finally. "To your sister, to the male who insulted you." Elara tensed, uncertain if this was approval or criticism. "Some would call that weakness," he continued. "And you?" Elara made herself ask. "What do you call it?" Alaric turned to look at her, and there was something considering in his golden eyes. "Strength," he said. "This court has known nothing but fear and force for centuries. They are terrified of me as they should be, but terror is a blunt instrument." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "What you did today, showing mercy while holding power that inspires loyalty, that is a tool of a queen." He paused, his expression hardening. "But it is also a vulnerability." Elara frowned. "What do you mean?" "This court is a nest of vipers, Elara. They have served me for centuries out of fear. Now you are here, my fated mate, my queen. You have a power they cannot understand, and they will test it. They will see your mercy as weakness. They will see your kindness as a flaw to be exploited. He moved closer, and suddenly the air between them felt charged. Electric. Your greatest test will not come from an enemy who shouts at the gates, Alaric said, his voice dropping lower. It will come from a whisper in the halls. It will come from someone who smiles at you, someone who offers you comfort, someone who claims to be your friend. A cold premonition slid down Elara's spine. You're trying to scare me. I'm trying to prepare you. His hand cupped her chin, tilting her face up to his. You cannot trust blindly, especially with those from your past. His thumb brushed across her bottom lip, and Elara's breath caught. Envy is poison, Alaric murmured. Your sister holds a full cup of it. She will not let this go easily. Seraphina is trapped in a disgraced pack, Elara said, though even as she spoke, doubt crept in. She lost. What more could she do? Alaric's expression was grim. People who have lost everything are the most dangerous. They have nothing left to lose. Before Elara could respond, he lowered his head, and his lips brushed against hers, not quite a kiss, just a whisper of contact that sent electricity racing down her spine. I will not let them harm you, he growled against her mouth. But you must learn to see the daggers before they are at your throat. Then he properly kissed her. It was nothing like the claiming bite. That had been primal, possessive, overwhelming. This was more, deeper. The golden bond between them flared to life. No longer just a background presence, but a living, burning connection that consumed everything else. Elara's hands came up to grip his shoulders, needing something to anchor herself as the world tilted. She could feel his emotions through the bond now, the fierce protectiveness, the desire, the absolute certainty that she was his, and anyone who threatened her would die screaming. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt safe. For the first time in her entire life, completely and utterly safe. When Alaric finally pulled back, his golden eyes were burning with that molten intensity that made her knees weak. Rest, he said, his voice rough. Tomorrow, you begin learning what it means to be queen. Then he was gone, the door closing silently behind him, leaving Elara alone with the echo of the bond still singing in her veins. She pressed her fingers to her lips and felt herself smile. Tomorrow could bring whatever it wanted. Tonight, she was no longer the runt. Chapter 6. The days blurred together in a haze of overwhelming sensation. Elara woke each morning to silent attendants who dressed her in heavy velvets and silks that felt like costumes. She was led through endless corridors of black stone to chambers where Valerius, the silver-haired advisor, taught her about Lycan politics and protocol and the 1,000 subtle ways power moved through the court. She learned that the Lycan Kingdom wasn't a single territory but a web of alliances and vassals spanning the entire continent, that King Alaric had ruled for over 1,000 years, crushing rebellions and absorbing rival territories until no one dared challenge him, that his word was absolute law, and his justice was swift and brutal. She learned that she was expected to hold court, to pass judgment, to command the respect of beings who had existed for centuries before she was born. And through it all, the golden bond with Alaric thrummed in her chest, constant, steady, alive. But the greatest change was internal. The power that had awakened during the claiming wasn't going away. It was growing. Elara's senses had sharpened to an almost painful degree. She could hear conversations 3 rooms away, could smell lies before they were fully spoken, a sour, acidic scent that made her nose wrinkle, could feel the subtle shifts of dominance and submission in every interaction. And she was strong. The morning she'd accidentally shattered a solid oak table by gripping it too hard, the attendants had gone pale and hurried away. Elara had stared at the splintered wood, at her unmarked hands, and felt a thrill of something that might have been fear or excitement or both. This power didn't feel borrowed. It felt like something that had always been inside her, just sleeping, waiting. But with the power came challenges. The Lycan court watched her constantly, measuring, judging, looking for weakness. Some were openly contemptuous, like the young male Alaric had nearly killed. Others were subtly dismissive, their golden eyes sliding past her as if she were furniture. Only a few showed anything approaching respect. Tonight, Elara stood on one of the fortress's many balconies, trying to escape the suffocating attention for a few moments. The balcony was a terrifying precipice carved into the mountainside, with nothing but open air and a 1,000-foot drop beyond the stone railing. The wind howled around her, whipping her hair into tangles, but she barely felt the cold. You should be inside. Elara didn't turn. She'd felt him coming through the bond, a sudden warmth, a magnetic pull toward the doorway behind her. Alaric stepped out onto the balcony, his dark coat billowing in the wind. He'd been in council for 6 hours, dealing with territorial disputes and vassal obligations, and he looked weary. The lines around his eyes were deeper than usual. "I can't," Elara admitted. "It's all too loud." Alaric moved to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long moment, they just stood there, looking out at the darkness together. "The bond is settling," he said finally. "It's awakening your own bloodline. The Omegas of the Silver Moon Pack were not always so domestic. Your ancestors were strong." Elara looked down at her hands. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm going to break something every time I move." "You're adjusting." His hand found hers, warm and steady. "You have iron in your veins, Elara. It's just been waiting for fire to forge it." He traced the lines on her palm, and the simple touch sent heat racing up her arm. "You are not an Omega," he said, his voice dropping to that low, possessive growl that made her shiver. "You are not weak. You are mine." He tugged her closer, and Elara let herself be pulled against his chest. The bond flared between them, wrapping around her like a blanket, and for the first time in days, the chaos in her mind quieted. "I'm beginning to understand that," she whispered. Alaric's arms wrapped around her, solid and protective, and Elara closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would face the court again, would navigate the politics and contempt and danger. But tonight, in the circle of her mate's arms, she was safe. Chapter 7. The letter arrived 6 days after Elara's arrival at the Lycan court. She was in the Queen's Solar, a smaller, less oppressive room than the formal chambers when Valerius appeared in the doorway. His aristocratic face was tight, with something that looked like concern, or fear. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing. "I apologize for the interruption, but there has been a development." Elara set down the book she'd been pretending to read. "What kind of development?" Valerius hesitated, and that hesitation made Elara's stomach clench. In the days since she'd arrived, the silver-haired advisor had been nothing but calm, controlled, utterly unflappable. Seeing him uncertain was wrong. "A message has arrived," Valerius said carefully. "Delivered anonymously by a traveling beta. It concerns you, Your Majesty." The bottom dropped out of Elara's world. What does it say? Perhaps it would be better if His Majesty. "What does it say?" Elara stood, and power leaked into her voice without her meaning it to. The bond in her chest flared, responding to her agitation. Valerius's eyes widened slightly. Then he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of cheap parchment. "The king is being informed as we speak," he said. "But given that the accusation names you directly, I thought you should see it first." He held out the letter. Elara's hands trembled as she took it. The parchment was rough, the kind used by common traders. The handwriting was cramped and anonymous. She read, "To the Lycan court. I write as a loyal member of the Silver Moon Pack, burdened by terrible knowledge. The Omega called Elara is not what she seems. Her rejection by Alpha Kaelen was a carefully planned deception designed to gain sympathy and infiltrate the Lycan Kingdom. She is still loyal to her true mate. They meet in secret. She has used dark magic to fake the king's bond, and she plots to assassinate him and place Kaelen on the throne. She is a serpent. She will be his end. A concerned wolf." The letter fell from Elara's numb fingers. No. This was Seraphina. It had to be. The same tactic she'd used before. A public lie designed to isolate, to make Elara seem treacherous. And it had worked on Kaelen. "Your Majesty?" Valerius's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you—" The door burst open. King Alaric strode in, his expression carved from ice. Behind him, 2 more council members hovered uncertainly in the hallway. His golden eyes found Elara, and for one terrible moment, they were cold. "Alaric," Elara whispered. "You know this is a lie." "You know what I know," Alaric said, his voice utterly devoid of warmth, "is that this accusation has been made public. The entire court is aware of it, and if I simply dismiss it without proof, they will assume you've bewitched me." He picked up the fallen letter, his jaw tight. "They already question your worthiness," he continued. "This gives them justification. So what do we do?" Elara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "How do I fight this?" Alaric's eyes met hers, And they were not the eyes of her mate. They were the cold, assessing eyes of the Blood King. "We have a trial," he said. "Public, formal, where the truth can be proven beyond doubt." Elara's breath stopped. "A trial. Here, with your court." "No." Alaric's smile was sharp and cold. "We return to the Silver Moon Pack. The letter claims treasonous meetings on their territory. We will hold the trial there where the supposed crime occurred." He turned to Valerius. "Send a royal summons. Alpha Vance, his son Kaelen, and the Lady Seraphina are to present themselves for the trial of their queen. 3 days. "Your Majesty," Valerius began. 3 days, Alaric repeated, and his voice carried the weight of absolute command. Valerius bowed and disappeared. Alaric stood there for a moment longer, the letter crumpled in his fist, looking at Elara with an expression she couldn't read. Then he turned and walked out without another word. The door closed, and Elara was left alone with the cold certainty settling in her bones. Her sister wasn't finished with her, not even close. Chapter 8. 3 days later, Elara stood in the grand clearing once more, the same ground where Kaelen had rejected her. The same audience, now kneeling in terror as King Alaric's imperial guard lined the perimeter. The same moon overhead, though only a crescent now, but everything else had changed. Elara wore midnight blue velvet and a golden crown. Her sapphire and gold eyes swept across the assembled pack with cold authority. The power humming in her veins was no longer foreign, it was hers. Seraphina stood across from her, dressed in her finest but looking haggard. When their eyes met, her sister's expression flickered between defiance and fear. Kaelen knelt nearby, a hollow shell, his father beside him, gray and trembling. King Alaric stood at the exact center where the rejection had occurred, his presence a cold star of dominance. "The trial begins," he announced. "Queen Elara stands accused of treason of conspiring with her former pack to assassinate the king." Seraphina stepped forward, playing her part. "I witnessed their meetings. She still loves him. She's used dark magic to— Where is your proof?" Alaric's voice cut through her theatrics like a blade. "The letter, the anonymous letter." Alaric's smile was predatory. "Written by whom?" He gestured, and 2 guards dragged forward the beta traveler who delivered it. "Tell them," Alaric commanded. The beta's voice shook. "The Lady Seraphina. She paid me with her mother's silver necklace, told me to deliver it anonymously." Seraphina's face went white. "He's lying. She got to him. This is—" Silence. The command wasn't Alaric's. It was Elara's. Her voice carried the full weight of her awakened power, and Seraphina's mouth snapped shut, her eyes going wide with shock. Elara stepped forward, her movements deliberate. "You claim I met Kaelen in secret, that we plotted against the king. I saw— You saw nothing." Alaric's voice was cold satisfaction. "Because it was impossible. My imperial guard has had Kaelen under constant surveillance since we left. He has not left the pack house in 3 weeks. He has spoken to no one in secret." The truth landed like an executioner's blade. Seraphina's carefully constructed lie, her anonymous letter, her false witness, her desperate gambit was impossible. "No," Seraphina whispered, her composure cracking. "No, it was supposed to. It worked on Kaelen. It was supposed to work on you." The confession hung in the air. She'd just admitted to manipulating the original rejection, to orchestrating everything. Kaelen stared at Seraphina, his hollow eyes filling with a horror that went beyond his void. "You," his voice was broken. "You did this. All of it. You poisoned me against my fated mate. You destroyed my soul. For this," he stood, and his movement was sharp, violent. "I want nothing to do with you. You are no Luna of mine. You are nothing." The public rejection, a mirror of what he'd done to Elara, shattered Seraphina completely. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, and began crawling toward Elara. "Please, Addie, please. You're my sister." I was just jealous." "Please." Her hands grasped at the hem of Elara's velvet gown. Every eye in the clearing watched, waiting. Chapter 9. Elara looked down at her sister. Seraphina, the golden child, the perfect one, the sister who'd smiled while watching her break, was now a sobbing, desperate creature clinging to her dress. The symmetry was perfect. Elara reached down slowly. Seraphina's eyes lit with desperate hope. Then Elara unhooked her sister's fingers from the velvet. One by one, she took a single step back. "No," Elara said. Her voice was quiet. Cold. Final. You are not my sister. She looked at Seraphina with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, no mercy. You are a lesson. She turned her back on Seraphina's broken sobs, looked at Kaelen, kneeling in his void, and felt nothing but distant pity. He would be alpha of a disgraced pack, forever living with what he'd destroyed. That was punishment enough. Elara turned to face King Alaric. He stood watching her, and in his golden eyes was fierce, possessive pride. He held out his hand. She took it, their fingers laced together, and the golden bond flared to life, visible to every witness. A shimmering aura that wrapped around them both. My queen, Alaric said, loud enough for all to hear. Together, they turned their backs on the Silver Moon pack, on Elara's old life, on everything she'd been. Behind them, Seraphina screamed her name. But Elara was already walking away, her hand in her mate's, her head held high. The runt was dead. The queen had been born. Chapter 10. The journey back to the Lycan Kingdom was silent, but it wasn't the cold silence of doubt or distance. It was the comfortable quiet of two people who no longer needed words. When they arrived at the fortress, the Lycan court was assembled. This time, when Elara walked through the hall, the whispers were different. She faced them, exposed the traitor, showed mercy and strength both. Valeria stepped forward and bowed deeply. Your Majesty, the court has witnessed your trial. We were wrong to doubt. One by one, the Lycans knelt, not in fear, in respect. Elara stood at King Alaric's side, feeling the weight of their regard. And for the first time since arriving, she didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like their queen. That night, Alaric found her on the balcony again. No regrets? He asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Elara leaned back into his warmth, feeling the bond sing between them. None, she said truthfully. She thought of Seraphina, trapped in her hollow victory, of Kaelen, living in his void, of the pack that had scorned her, now disgraced. She thought of the power thrumming in her veins, the crown on her head, the mate at her back, the kingdom that was now hers. I spent 20 years being nothing, Elara said quietly. Being invisible, being weak. She turned in Alaric's arms, meeting his burning golden eyes. I'm not weak anymore. No, Alaric agreed, his voice filled with dark satisfaction. You're not. He kissed her, then deep and claiming and absolute, and the bond between them blazed like a star. Below them, the Lycan Kingdom stretched into the darkness. Hers to rule, hers to command, hers. Elara, who had been the runt, the wolfless shame, the rejected and broken girl sobbing in the dirt, was now the High Queen of the Lycan Kingdom. And she would never be weak again. And that is how the runt became the High Queen. Thank you so much for watching Elara's journey all the way to the end. If you love stories where the underdog finally gets the crown, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now, I have a serious question for you guys in the comments. I really want to know what you think. Did Seraphina get off too easy? Elara just walked away and left her in the mud. But after years of poisoning her own sister and stealing her mate, did she deserve a harsher punishment? Or is living with a broken, regretful Kaelen the ultimate revenge? Let me know your verdict down below.